start. Okay, so today we're continuing our sojourn through social movement theory, and we're getting to the last of the American social movement theory section, and we're going to talk about framing, which is a very specific way of thinking about how social movements interact with culture and how they communicate. And like the other theories we talked about, this happens very much in conversation with previous versions of social movement theory. So again, it's movement theorists being sort of both self-critical but also critical of each other. If any of you read, which I would recommend, Gemma's chapter in the Movements and Protests book about framing, she has a nice bit in there about Goodwin and Jasper against Snow and McAdam, and she gives Goodwin and Jasper their jazz win. They're like a social movement's power couple intellectually. There's basically sort of this big argument that goes on in social movement studies where people start to say that social movement studies is too focused on political systems, which the theories we talked about over the past couple of weeks, resource mobilisation theory, political process theory, both do this. They're both really focused on the political system. How do people mobilise resources in it? How do people take advantage of opportunities within that structure? And then people start to say, but what's been ignored is how movements use or construct meaning. So it's not just, is there objectively a situation that can change or needs to change? How do people come to perceive that? How do people come to understand that, there's an injustice that needs to be addressed? How do they come to try to convince other people that change needs to happen? So rather than thinking about opportunity structures as something outside of movements that they take advantage of, it's trying to sort of give back some agency to the movement itself. How do movements create opportunities, and how do they communicate that to other people? So it's a question about how they create and communicate meaning to audiences to convince them about the need for social change, the root of the problem, and the necessary solution. Okay, so this concept of cultural frames is put forward by David Snow et al. There's a bunch of them, which is actually one of the readings recommended for this week. There's a few on the blackboard for this week. I don't mind which ones you read, just read some of them. Snow comes up with this idea of cultural frames. So what are frames? So they're a cognitive or mental construct that help us make sense of situations by telling us how to interpret them. So Snow and Benford are another kind of movements power combo. They write together quite often, and they describe a frame as an interpretive schemata that simplifies and condenses the world out there by selectively punctuating and encoding objects, situations, events, and experiences. So frames are mental tools that people use to create meaning and to understand the world around them. And Snow gets the concept from Erving Goffman, who I'm sure you've all heard before. Very much into, he's an anthropologist, sort of a sociologist as well, but he does a lot of field work where he talks about performance and the constructions of meaning in social performance and stuff, and they get this framing idea from him. And so it's they put what it is in quite a wordy, intellectual kind of way. But basically what they're saying is that we have these kind of sets of understandings in our head that work as tools for understanding the world. So when we come across an object, a situation, an event, or we have an experience, we employ these frames that we have to try to understand them. So something happens to you, and you can be like, oh, okay, this is an example of this phenomena that I have experienced before, that someone else has told me about, that is sort of like something that is culturally significant. So we've walked past a group of people with a cake with candles on it, singing to another person, and we would apply like the right frames to understand that like a birthday is happening. You know, I mean, it's a way that like we have meanings already in our heads that we apply to the world to understand it. So it's a set of understandings in our head. It's like a frame. Yeah, a frame is like a frame of interpretation. It's the sort of parameters we put around the world to make it mean something to us, to make the world meaningful, to understand how it works. So, the question when it comes to social movements is, how do people come to know reality in ways that lead to political protest? So how do people end up with frames that mean that they understand something as unjust or in need of change, and how do they come to know that reality as something that needs to be different? So rather than sort of just like, that is what it is, and it's also thinking about, this is what it is, but it ought to be some other way, basically. So perhaps on our birthday, you know, there's people being left out or something, and we'd be like, that's not fair, people shouldn't be left out. All of those people around that table should get a bit of cake, or something like that. You know, how do people come to understand reality in this kind of like way where they relate to it politically, but also kind of like, how do they come to relate to it in a way that sort of empowers them to change it? Because dominant frames normally shape our understanding of the world. Again, normally, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, is like social norms construct certain frames which are then repeated, which we learn to apply to the world. So like we might learn, for instance, so in our society, like work is a dominant frame. We understand work in a certain way. We understand it as getting up at 9 in the morning, going to, I guess probably in our culture, like in the UK, probably going to an office, sitting down and doing something boring that we don't like and don't want to do for 8 hours, and in return for that, we get money. That's our understanding of work. That's the way that work is framed to us, and also it's framed in moral ways. So like working hard is good, having a good work ethic is good, being lazy is bad. That's a certain way of constructing the meaning of work, which comes from the dominant form of power in our society. Whereas like in other forms of society, that frame wouldn't make any sense. Like, you know, in most forms of human existence, people didn't go and work in another place for money from someone else. They worked on, they either worked on their own bit of land, or they gathered stuff from a sort of a wider territory that they lived in, and there wasn't sort of this kind of separation of work out into a separate sphere of existence where you went and you worked for money. That would be alien to most people that have existed, basically. But to us, we would understand work in that sense, which is you kind of like, I always think a really interesting example of this is when like you see kind of, especially kind of like, I mean it's not like, we shouldn't go too deep cultural criticism on it, but it is kind of, I always find it kind of funny, is when like you see sort of like cartoon or children's depictions of the past, where they'll depict people in, say, like, the Middle Ages, or like, even in like prehistoric times, in the same way that we understand work. So, you know, like there'll be someone in the Middle Ages who, like, you know, waves goodbye to, and it's often gendered in the same way as well. So, like, a guy will wave goodbye to his wife in the morning and go off to work at the brewery or whatever in his medieval life. Like, and then he'll come back at home at the end and she'll be there with his dinner and stuff like that. That's not how work operated in the Middle Ages. That separation between, like, home and work was not there. Work happened at home and people did it as a family unit. You worked with your partner. The separation between work and home life, public and private, is actually sort of particular to our society. So that whole frame of work, as we understand it, when applied to that context, is anachronistic. And actually, if you brought someone from that context here and they saw how we work, they'd be like, what the hell is going on? This makes no sense. So we're used to, like, these dominant frames shaping our understandings of the world. And then what a movement has to do is develop an alternative frame that can motivate collective action or frame something as unjust. So then that story I've just told you, you can link to, and the reason I've come up with it is because I've been writing a lecture on primitive accumulation for another course, but like you can add an injustice frame to that, where like the reason that we now work as in alienated workplaces as wage labourers is because the form of life in which we worked on our own bit of land ended because that land was expropriated and stolen from us all across the world, basically. And that's changing that kind of like, that frame that I just did there, which is kind of like a Marxist and a decolonial Marxist frame as well, because obviously like the expropriation was different across the globe and operated on different timescales and with different levels of ferocity. So that initial frame I had was of like historical curiosity. Oh look, the past was different to how it was now. I made it an injustice frame by being like, and this is how that happened. It happened through a process of violence and injustice, basically. So one of the things that movements have to do is to create that alternative frame which motivates people to collective action. So in that sense, it might be like, so in our current society, the way we relate to work is that we are alienated from each other, we are alienated from the products of our labour, and therefore we need to create a new society in which we are no longer alienated. You know, so then that would be that, and that is one of the classic collective action frames of socialism, basically. So, but crucially, this is a really important distinction. Frames are a bit like ideologies, but they're not as broad. So like an ideology is a general set of ideas and beliefs, is like a sort of a broad, like, society level sort of a sort of society level interpretation. Frames are more specific. So whereas like we might talk about like the process of capitalist production as a societal injustice, frames are more likely to talk about like a specific instance. So perhaps there's a sweatshop and we critique that and we have a frame around that where sweatshops are bad, why people working in sweatshops need to be emancipated, how they might emancipate themselves, how other people ought to relate to it. And that frame might be part of a broader ideology, could be part of a socialist ideology, could be part of a liberal ideology, could be part of a, whatever you want fancy ideology. But frames are a sort of, a more focused kind of interpretation of a more specific situation. And Faure and Merrill, which is, I'm not sure about this actually. They say frames tell us how to think about things, ideologies tell us why it matters. And I sort of instinctively thought, that sounds about right. Like, a frame is telling us how to think about this specific situation, and an ideology is a broader thing where it's both the situation and our values and how they relate to each other. But then, it's probably more complicated than that. So I was just going through the lecture slides again this morning and I saw that and I was like, I actually don't know how I feel about that. But it is something to think about, I guess. Like, what is the difference between a frame and an ideology? And I guess probably we should understand those things as being connected. like we might have a broad ideological approach to the world, we will have specific frames within that. So, yeah, so we might have like a broader critique of capitalism, but within that we might have a frame for a specific aspect of capitalism, that it is exploitative, that it is violent, that it is patriarchal, that it is racist, that it is, and these might all be ways of framing specific aspects of it, which hangs together in this sort of broader ideology. Okay, so framing processes in this sort of set of ideas they're sort of strategic attempts by, again, we've got social movement organisations come up again, so we haven't completely abandoned all of the political process, resource mobilisation stuff. This is often the same people. McAdam is kicking about in this sort of like theoretical world again. He's still there. A lot of the same people are there. But they're, rather than talking about social movement organisations mobilising resources or taking advantage of opportunities, they're talking about how these organisations frame an issue in ways that are going to appeal to people's existing cultural beliefs or transform the way they think about the world. So it's either you're trying to appeal to perhaps like an already established set of understandings of the world, understandings of justice. So you might have a movement that critiques so it might make an appeal to like democracy. So democracy is already an established way of like understanding what a good society would look like. A good society would be democratic. That's how a lot of people already think about the world in the society we're in right now. So you can appeal, so a movement organisation could appeal to other people based on like, we need to do this to advance democracy, or this thing that we're critiquing isn't democratic, we need to make it democratic. Or you could have a frame which is trying to transform the way people think about the world. So rather than sort of appealing to an existing kind of understanding, you're trying to teach people a new way to think about the world. Sort of like a pedagogical process. It's a learning process. You're trying to show people that actually this is a specific form of injustice. You think this is fine, actually it is not, or you think that it's all right to not do anything about this, you're incorrect. It's your moral responsibility to act. Or, I think especially important in our society, you might be trying to convince people that actually things can change. Like they might not believe that things can change, and you often encounter that, especially in like the media, but also in general conversation with people. People have the skepticism that actually anything could change, and a lot of what movements are trying to do is convince people that that is in fact false, which it is. And if anyone's feeling not very hopeful today, don't worry. Everything changes. We know that as a fact. Okay, so and we've got some examples up here as well. So we can see that, like, so a classic example of like a transformative way to, an attempt at framing something the transformative way is sort of like the vegan frame of like meat is murder, right? So that's trying to transform the way people think about consuming animal products to seeing it as a form of violence and or exploitation, whereas previously people would just be like, that's food, innit? Like it's trying to transform the way that people understand the world. So rather than seeing like, a steakhouse and being like, dinner, people see a steakhouse and like, oh, disgusting, murdering bastards, like it's a way of transforming that frame. So when people encounter new experiences or encounter different things, they're able to interpret it in a different way. And we've also got up there sort of an interesting kind of framing, which is the pro-choice movement trying to appeal to people's Christian values to convince people to agree with them. So they're saying Satan is pro-choice. That's an existing cultural belief that Satan exists and he is bad, and then it's associating it with something that you don't like in order to convince people that they should agree with your position because that is like the godly position, or like the one that is consistent with their beliefs, basically. Yeah, sure.
Now, I just want to know what is the difference between Sprague ideology and forming a frame.
Yeah.
What is its difference and similarity?
Okay, so I guess that's like a kind of my problem with reading that sentence again this morning was like I'm perhaps not sure, I guess, but I think probably the easiest way to think about it is that like I would think of an ideology as a kind of like as something that coordinates all of the different frames. So you might have a frame that understands a particular kind of injustice in a certain way, but if you have an ideology, it's going to be all of the different frames, all of the different kind of like political, moral frames that you have in your head that like cohere in a certain way, that they fit together. Not necessarily coherently, that can be contradictory, and people do that all the time, but like that there's an ideology is more of a, rather than framing something is like framing a specific situation, whereas an ideology is an understanding of the world. Like it's more kind of systemic and abstract, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. I believe maybe spreading ideology is a combination of the many processes both try, form a frame. Like I remember in my history book, there's many in the Chinese Revolution, many communist. Well, the first step for a Communist Party member try to spread the communist ideology to the farmers, tell them why the landlord took all those result of the land from you is not right, and I believe that can be treated as forming a frame. I don't know.
Yeah. So that's a really good example of, I guess, like how you could use a transformative action frame to build towards an ideological understanding. So yeah, it's very difficult to go to a group of people and sell them not sell them, that's probably too cynical, but like convince them of the whole ideology. It's like, okay, I'm going to come up to you, stranger in the street who I don't know, and convince you that wholesale capitalism is, a crime against humanity. That's very abstract. Whereas if I come up to you and it's like, you know that you don't like your boss, right? And most people are going to go, no, I don't like my boss. You know how like every day you feel like your soul is being sucked out in exchange for money? You know how you feel like that? That's because your boss is exploiting you. And then that's something that people can hang on. That's something that kind of like is tangible to people. So then that from that frame you could start to build up into like having an understanding of like the world as being about people who exploit and people who are exploited, and the emancipation of the exploited being the goal of a broader set of political ideas. But yeah, no, it's an interesting kind of like, it's one of those things where like they're not separate, they're definitely related, and probably how you separate them out depends kind of on what you're doing. Okay, so yeah, so when movement organisations are doing these framing processes, they package like different things together, so like certain discourses, symbols, slogans, images, so that they're like culturally and emotionally resonant. So like both of these images up here, even though they're sort of about very different things and from very different groups of people, both have like an imagery of like blood, right? They're trying to convince, they're using a kind of specific symbolic creation of meaning to be like, the thing that we are fighting against is a form of violence. The shedding of blood is involved in both of these in this process that we are critiquing. And although, I'm sure that these groups are probably politically, ideologically completely different to each other, you can see that they're drawing on a shared set of frames, a shared set of sort of symbols, slogans and images. You might hear sort of like movements using like different versions of the same slogan, or like often you'll get movements trying to draw on previous ways of activism, draw on their slogans and use them again, or adapt them in some way. And you also can see kind of the movement of frames across movements as well. So a really sort of compelling kind of, a compelling frame will spread across movements as people will start using it sort of in a copycat kind of fashion, because it works. And you could, I mean, again, this is a little bit cynical, but you could think about, and we'll think about this as well when we come back to the critiques, you can think of this as a bit like a marketing strategy. So a social movement organisation might try to frame their issue in a way, in a very sort of PR focused kind of way. It's like they're sort of trying to workshop, how do we appeal to people? What will people like? What will people not like? And again, there's, it could be that cynical, but often it isn't. Often there are actually having serious conversations about what kinds of slogans or images or what kinds of symbols can we mobilise that people will go for, and what others will we have to convince people of. So I've been in several discussions where people on the left are discussing whether they should call themselves communists or not. And it's they are communists, but then obviously that word comes with a lot of historical baggage. So then people will be should we call ourselves communists and try and convince people that actually communism does not mean the Soviet Union, or do we not call ourselves communists because that's not going to appeal to people? So you can also think about the same, even the same kind of frame, the same kind of issue can be approached in this appeal to existing culture or an attempt to transform it. So you could have an approach to that frame which is people don't like communism now, so we're going to call ourselves the Freedom Democrats or something like that, or trying to appeal to things that everybody likes, Or you could be no, communism does not equal the Soviet Union, those are not the same things, so we're going to call ourselves communists and we're going to teach people what communism actually is. So you could have a different approach to that frame depending on what you decide, basically. Which again is a nice thing about this sort of framing theory, is that it does give movements that sort of agency. It's choices are being made, commitments are being made, strategic kind of interactions are being planned for. Okay. Yeah, and they try to align the interpretation of a problem with those of potential participants. So there's no point there's no point those communists trying to appeal to conservatives, right? They're not going to go for it, it's not going to fly. Who are they trying to appeal to? They're trying to appeal to people already on the left, or people who it's possible to convince to be part of their group. Or you could see that with any kind of movement. An environmental movement is not trying to appeal to a CEO of an oil company. Not going to win them over. No, they're not going to come around. They have very strong interests to not agree with you. They may even hate you. So who are you going to appeal to? You're going to try and appeal to the people who are already affected by the actions of that company. And that process we call frame alignment. So it's thinking about trying to match the interpretive framework of the movement or movement organisation with people, basically, who might get involved. Okay, and we can think about different kinds of frames. So you can think about frame bridging, so linking different frames together. Or you can think about frame amplification, which is a kind of a clarifying process. So this is what this thing actually means, rather than what you think it means. Or perhaps this thing has been misinterpreted. This is actually the meaning of this concept or this frame. And you can also talk about frame extension, which is kind of broadening a frame. So a classic example of that is sort of trying to make sorry, the example I had in my head is just completely fled. But like, it's sort of a way of like trying to move a frame that already works in one context and extending it to include other things. So it might be like, so you might say something like, we don't exclude this group of people from this social situation, so why is it fair that we exclude this other group of people? So that's like a kind of frame extension. It's like, we already think that excluding people from, work, sport, whatever, is unjust. Why are we excluding this other group of people? And then the frame extension would be to extend it to like, and excluding this other group is also unjust. And you can also talk about like frame transformation. So it's like reframing something. It's like re-understanding it. So you might have this in like critiques of like girl boss feminism often do this. It's like trying to create a different understanding of what the emancipation of women in a capitalist society looks like. And because the existing frame of like, you too can become the patriarchal oppressor is like, is kind of, there's problems with that. We can already see problems with that. So like you can see in the feminist movement an attempt to reframe the way that like feminist politics of work is understood. So here you can see some other sort of like frames being constructed as well. We could do a deep dive on some of the meanings in some of these. So like we've got the people with the put British workers first, who are trying to link like a sort of nationalistic and xenophobic frame around work, and trying to link that into an understanding of kind of like an understanding of kind of like justice for working class people. So that's attempting to frame the oppression of working people in a nationalistic framework. So it's trying to pitch different workers against each other, basically. And that's a kind of like a frame bridging. They're trying to link together ideas. This is obviously the superheroes is like, anyone heard of Dads for Justice? Fathers for Justice? Yeah. There was kind of like, I mean, most of you guys are probably too young to remember it, because I am really. I remember them being on the news when I was like 10 or something. It was basically like these blokes who had, lost access to their children through divorce and wanted to be able to see their kids, which is fine and a good idea. But they sort of like framed the. So there was an element of the movement in which it got framed as if like men were being oppressed by women, which we all know is obviously ridiculous. But like there's an attempt of like frame transformation. So it's like kind of like it's not women that are oppressed in society, it's men. And there's also a really interesting way that like the dressing up as the superheroes is also kind of like an appeal to a frame of like imagined dominant patriarchal masculinity. It's like the very idea of the superhero is like an extremely patriarchal idea. It's like, oh, there's an injustice, there's a problem, Batman will save us, some big rich hench dude is going to come and save us. That's obviously a really masculinist fantasy. Like, so they appeal to like their perceived challenge to their fatherhood, literally their role as the patriarch, by appealing to an extremely patriarchal symbol. Actually, if you want to have something to read for fun, which is quite funny, David Graeber, who's one of my all-time favourites, has a really great essay about how Batman is fascist. I can't remember which one it is. The one of the first Christian Bale Batman films. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you. It's an essay about Dark Knight Rises, and basically how like Graeber writes about how Batman in it is like a fascist fantasy superhero, which is sort of like the establishment's reaction to Occupy. Basically, it's like the fear of the people in the streets, the fear of the mob, which we talked about when we talked about collective behaviour theory, is being defeated, put back in its box by this big hench rich guy, you know, and that's quite, yeah. Graeber has this wonderful thing about how that's like a fascist process, or like a fascist kind of framing of the politics of the time. And then we've got a sort of a SWP logo as well, which is kind of drawing on kind of a classic socialist symbolism, really, and trying to appropriate it for their party. Okay. So the political process model, which is sort of a kind of an addition to the political process theory we've been talking about already, it starts to try and put together the kind of ideas we've already been talking about into a wider theory. So it tries to put like political opportunity, the political opportunity model, tries to put it together with resource mobilization and this framing analysis. So it's trying to it's like, okay, so we were kind of right about political opportunities, but that got too reductive. We were kind of right about the resource mobilization, we were kind of right about the political opportunities, but now we've got this cultural frames thing, which is also kind of right, and we're going to just try and sort of like mush that all together, basically. We're going to try and combine those things, which sort of does kind of, you can see how it would work. So like you can analyse the way that a movement is interacting with the political structure around it. You can understand the way that people frame the issue to take advantage of that opportunity, and you can also talk about how they use frames to mobilise resources, how those resources interact with different opportunities. You can sort of like do this like mushing together, where all of these things perhaps try to start to make sense. And you do kind of start to get perhaps like a free-level kind of approach to understanding movements. So you have the cultural, which is like subjective, agency-focused, and you have like the mobilisation of resources into like an organisation, which remember we put like in the middle of civil society and the state, and then you have that interacting with like an objective state structure, basically. So this all sort of starts to get put together into a wider model, and then you get Tarrow's idea of waves or cycles of protest, in which like the opportunities created or discovered by previous movements, the resources, the ways of mobilising, the frames, inspire other movements. And Tarrow's has this like idea of like master frames. So you might have like a certain period of like uprisings or protest, or this certain wave of protest, which is inspired by a specific master frame. So like Occupy, you could you can link together Occupy, Arab Spring, Indignados, all those movements of the squares in the early 2010s through like the Indignados sort of slogan of democracy aurelia, like real democracy now. That was like, that animated all of those movements. Like that was kind of a master frame of that wave of contention, was the attempt to create or win a real form of democracy, in contrast to a kind of like compromised form of democracy. And around the same time, you also got the kind of master frame of like, we are the 99%. People heard that? Yeah. So around the same time, like the protests against austerity and against the banks in the wake of the financial crisis was framed, which came from Occupy in this "we are the 99% language," as in like we're representing most people against this 1% who are oppressing us. Okay, is that your? Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Okay. we're doing well with the time. So we're going to do some critique after the break, but before we get to that, and I haven't got slides for that because we're just going to, I'm going to do some drawings again, sorry. But yeah, some things to think about whilst we have the break, and sort of like critiques that we can get straight out the bat of the framing approach is that the concept of frames can kind of be quite narrow. There's a sense that like perhaps there's more to meaning and culture in social movements than just this kind of like PR kind of understanding of it. Like there is, because the framing idea comes from the same school of thought that brought us RMT and political process theory, there's still that rational actor embedded in it, like that kind of calculating individual who sees things in like cost-benefit terms, and what a frame is trying to do is to convince people that the costs of them taking action are lower and the benefits are higher. And it is kind of like, it does make it sound like a marketing strategy. But is there not more to the meanings that movements create and construct and apply than that? Is it that cynical? Basically, is kind of one of the ways we can sort of critique framing. Is it can make it sound quite instrumental, which is a problem with all of these rational actor theory based social movement theories, is that it makes collective action seem quite instrumental. It's quite cold. It's like it's rational calculation. It's like, what is going to benefit me? What is going to benefit my interests? How can I convince other people that what will benefit my interests will also benefit their interests? That kind of thing. And then there's also kind of like the critique of like the voluntarism in framing theory. So voluntarism is the idea of like, it's kind of like opposed to determinism. So if determinism is like the way that we act is completely shaped and dependent on the situations we find ourselves in, we don't have free will. Voluntarism is the opposite. Voluntarism is like, you have absolute free will, you can just do whatever you want. You can just pick stuff up and use it however you like. You can just create meanings out of thin air, that kind of stuff. So there is a kind of a critique of this approach that comes from that angle as well, of like, is culture something that is just another resource that you can employ, or is it also something that is, is it also something that like moves around you, that shapes you? Is it a tool that you can pick up and use, or is it something that determines you? You know, like, so it's a kind of like the sort of like, like the cultural determinists come for the kind of cultural voluntarism of framing theory, basically. It's sort of like, no, you cannot just use the discourse how you like, because that discourse has shaped you irrevocably. You can't get away from that kind of thing. Also like, you can see Francesco Paletta's critique of it is that like, the understanding of framing, it understands culture in a quite individualistic kind of way. Like when we talked about framing, it was talked about as like an interpretive schemata in someone's head. Like that culture exists in people's heads. But like, that's, if we're being, good sociologists, we have to understand culture as something relational. Culture doesn't just exist in your head or my head or their heads or whoever's head. It exists between people. It's something that we create together. So can we understand culture in this really kind of like individualistic way, which can be quite reductive? And again, is culture the opposite of a political structure? So there's a way that framing theory kind of, it sort of takes as given, like, the political structure constrains us, it restricts us, your actions are prevented by the state, but then it picks up culture as a kind of like a get out of jail free card. It's like, the political structure oppresses you, but you can use culture as like a way to get out of that. It's like you can apply meaning, you can create new meanings, That's kind of like where the agency comes from. But actually, we can have a sort of we need a more complex view of that. Like, can culture not also be constraining? Is there actually not a way that politics can also be mobilising or agentive? Like, is that sort of also a bit simplistic? Okay, so now, because we've done pretty well on time, which does make me worry that I rushed through stuff, but if anyone needs anything clarifying, we can do that after the break. So, if you want to come back at about 10 past, we'll go through the rest of it then. Oh, you need it. Is that what you said?
Yeah, but I don't know if it's obviously like technically when they're a national army or something. They have it's a wider social movement and they had an uprising, so I don't know if like, that's something that's happened to us. Yeah,
configuration.
yeah.
There'll be more. I basically like it's like, but yeah, there will be more like how do we account for, which we've done a bit of already. How do we account for revolutionary, like movements, and that could be a good way for you to like get into like the critique. It's like, like resource motivation, but it's way more than that. Like you said, like they have an eye, like you know, their whole kind of like way of approaching change is completely different to what is in the theory. And I mean that is also like. I think we'll get into more and more towards the end. Like, there's a way that like a lot of social movement theory, like as it is understood in the West, is very narrow and it's not that like, people don't get that. Like you do get like even some of these theorists being like we need to like understand how we account for something outside of the norm. Like, according to us, and they struggle with that. So I mean, that can be a really good way to start doing things. No,
I'm really glad about Yeah.
Okay. If we all come back. We'll run through some of the critiques of framing theory. Okay, so first of all, I think like the first and the kind of like easiest critique of framing theory, I think, is like the sense of instrumentality in it. It's the idea that like frames are constructed in order to get people to agree with you who might not necessarily agree with you. This idea that like framing is like a marketing strategy, that you're trying to sell a brand, like you're trying to sell a product which is like, I don't know, emancipation, like, and you're trying to do like a nice ad campaign to get people to want to be emancipated. But which I think completely misses something which we're going to talk about next week when we start to talk about new social movement theory and theories of collective identity, is that often like the meanings that movements construct and that they deploy and that they try to convince other people of they believe in those things. It's not like this is kind of like instrumental rationality of like, we need to put forward an argument by which we convince other people to agree with us. It's not that simple. A lot of these meanings are ones that those people think are true. It's like, it's not just that they think that it's going to get them more supporters, or that it's going to get, you know, it's going to be able to cut through in a kind of like in the way that often we talk about like electoral campaigns. It's like a social movement is generally not trying to appeal to like Mondeo man or like Warrington man or whatever man they decide it is this election that whoever wins the election has got to appeal to. Movements often aren't doing that. They often have like beliefs, right? The meaning to them is not kind of like a cynically deployed meaning. It's a true meaning. Like it doesn't. It's not necessarily that the movement is trying to create a frame that will convince people. It's that they're trying to convince people that the meaning that they are attributing to the world is true. Does that make sense? So it's less like we're just going to come up with an idea that people like. It's like we're going to try and convince people to like what we believe, basically. It's kind of it's not quite so instrumental. And also like there's kind of like a very, and I guess this is kind of treading on the toes of next week a little bit, but often it's like people's identities are folded up with those meanings. It's like it's not just that they think something isn't fair and they should do something about it. Often like their involvement in the movement is an important part of who they are. So they can't just deploy it instrumentally in the way that framing theory kind of puts it forward, because that cultural meaning is sort of like, sacrosanct almost. It's like you can't just deploy it cynically because it's true, to you. So like, I think that that's one of the easier ways to kind of get at framing theory, is this kind of like understanding of it as like a marketing campaign, which I think is sort of interesting that it also comes from the same theoretical background that proposes the idea of the social movement organisation, which kind of also is the idea of movement as a business, which it is not, right? It operates on a completely different mode of collectivity, a completely different mode of action, a completely different way of constructing meaning, and it's kind of neither of those things really fit. Like if you go and do field research and you talk to activists, you are not going to find people who think of themselves as business people doing marketing campaigns. You're going to meet people who see themselves as like campaigners, as activists, as promoting kind of justice, and who believe in a kind of a vision of the world or an understanding of like morals or like the good life or a better world, something like that. So like the instrumentalism of it is a way that we can kind of critique framing theory. And there's also an interesting way in the kind of like we can sort of see in it sort of some of like the circular thinking within like the field of social movement theory. Because if you remember back to when we talked about collective behaviour theory and like the symbolic interactionist approach, which was talking about like people being excited by changes in the shape of meaning, and their understanding of like cultural meaning is like all these ideas bouncing around, and then in some way that excites people, that creates collective behaviour, which is irrational. This kind of like the framing theory kind of does to that interactionist approach like what it does to the functionalist approach to the rules, if you get what I mean. It's like, rather than it being random, rather than it being irrational, it makes this cultural interaction rational. So rather than it being random like that, it's just like, oh, actually, you can create a bit of culture. You can create a frame. So if we think of this as our movement, they create this frame that they're trying to convince other people of. Oh, this is going to get messy really quick. Maybe I should have used a different colour. Never mind. But yeah, it's rather than like culture, like meaning coming out of like this random interaction of beliefs. It's basically making it kind of like rational. So you can see the rational actor theory. Like you can start to see within the framing approach, like the theoretical commitments that shape that mode of thinking. It's like they've already sort of exhausted the rationalist approach to like political opportunity structures. Somebody proposes to them that actually culture might be important, and they're like, okay, we're going to take culture into account, but they do it from the same theoretical position that they did that with, if that makes sense. They've sort of applied that kind of instrumental rationality to the sphere of culture, and then that means that like a political process model can emerge, which sort of like incorporates the critique, but actually sort of recreates the theoretical underpinnings that they already have. So then you get the idea that like, okay, so a movement creates a certain cultural frame or a certain cultural meaning. It then creates an SMO, right? Which then takes advantage of a political opportunity, like a gap in the law, something like that. So it's kind of like it incorporates this, it adopts the same logic, and it kind of just extends the theory. But this like framing approach still has the same problems that those theories have. So it still has this kind of like instrumental rationality, I guess. It's like, and then you can sort of have like a to-in and fro-in between all of these levels and stuff. So you have like the SMO tries to create a frame to bring more people in, and then the frame shapes the SMO, and you can get a nice kind of like relational, sort of the beginnings of a processual approach, but it's still understanding people as individuals rationally calculating things. It's still very psychological in the way that it understands people. It's quite individualistic. And it still sort of sees everything as operating within the parameters of like a capitalist state, basically. There's sort of not really a sense of like massive transformation, right? It still ends up quite gradual, because then you can then get sort of like, you still have all of your different SMOs and stuff, or like political organisations and political parties, and they're all like, you know, competing with each other and stuff. And then you get the same in like civil society, the same in the cultural sphere, where you get different like cultural frames, different meanings, all competing with each other. And it all takes as an assumption this idea of like competing particular interests. It has like that understanding, that bourgeois understanding of society is reproduced in the theory of understanding like individuals as competing with each other, as meanings as competing with each other, as organisations competing with each other, representing particular interests, which is a very like a historically specific way of understanding the world. Medieval people did not understand the world like this. They wouldn't have understood the relationship even between different groups of people as necessarily competing. They'd have understood them as like sets of reciprocal obligations. So like, which was unfair and exploitative. I'm not saying it's good. Please don't take away from me that feudalism is good. It's not good. It was bad. Like, people were exploited, but in a different way. And what capitalism does is exploit people in a new, fun, more violent way in some ways. But this sort of shape, this understanding of people as individuals, and this understanding of like competing particular interests governed by the law and the state through the law, is a very specific way of understanding society or understanding politics, and these theories reproduce that. They don't challenge that understanding. So it can be kind of difficult to see how, using this approach, you would understand, a movement like socialism, or even environmentalism, or revolutionary anti-racism, or feminism, which is not representing a particular interest, but trying to act on behalf of a universal interest. And again, this is where we kind of get back into the murky problem of the difference between an ideology and a frame. To act on behalf of the universal interest, to try and transform society, to change the shape of the whole social system, you don't need a frame. You need an ideology. Like you need an understanding of society as a totality. You need to understand how all the bits fit together, how they produce injustices, how by creating a new universal interest in place of the society of particular interests would lead to a situation in which we could address injustice, basically. Because you can kind of end up with sort of like that, these kind of like cultural approaches, like reifying the sphere of competing interests. It becomes like for this group, this meaning is important, and for this group, this other meaning is important, and those are in conflict with each other. But if you take too much of a kind of like cultural determinist approach, that ends up like inescapable. So all you end up with is that like these competing particular interests are permanent and inescapable. So you end up with a kind of like opposite form of determinism. So whereas like you can kind of have like a positivist determinism, which is like there is a set of rules, there's a sort of a one singular universal truth which is always true. That ends up deterministic because everything obeys the rules all the time and there's no escape from that. You can also end up with a kind of like opposite form of determinism, which is kind of like a cultural determinism, where it's like everybody has these different meanings which are impenetrable to each other, which are irreconcilable, and therefore everything is chaos. It's all this bouncing around, and again, it becomes determinism, right? It's just a determinism where, like, rather than in the positivist form of determinism, where the thing that's determining you is truthful, is full of truth, is like determining in that sense. It's like what is determining you is just as determinative, but it is empty. So, which you kind of get like the opposition of like a kind of deterministic God and a deterministic nihilism, like sort of this is the truth and the eternal truth versus there is no such thing as truth, and they both end up in determinism basically, but just from two different fun directions basically. Which this is, I mentioned her at the start, is sort of Gillian Rose's read of what happens to sociology basically when it does this thing where like and I mean, good luck if you want to try and read Gillian Rose. It's really hard. It took me like months. So, good luck. But there are some good summaries of her work out there. But yeah, but she has this thing of like one of the problems that we face when we try to understand like politics is that we do this thing where like we jump between, which is this is what I'm getting at. Social movement theory does this. We jump between like validity and values. So this is kind of like truth, sort of like what is, and this is kind of like and values, I guess, is kind of self-explanatory, but kind of like yeah, I guess we can sort of have it as beliefs. So like ought, like what ought to be, like what is, what ought to be, how ought we to relate to each other, and what is. And sociology tends to do this thing where like it will use one of these and it will make it what she calls like the a priori. So it's like the thing that is before, it's the truth that comes before everything else. So you'll get like a social theory that goes, okay, so how do we understand society? How do we understand what it means? We understand that there is a certain structure of truth that determines this society. There's a certain way that you can make claims that are true in a certain social form, which is what Foucault does in his like archaeological period. If you read The Order of Things, that's what he's doing. Foucault is saying, in the 16th century, there was this way of understanding crime and punishment or discipline. And then in the 17th, 18th century, you get another one, and now it's completely different. But he has no account of why that happened. There's no account of mediation. There's no account of social change. He doesn't have a philosophy of history. So then what do you do? Okay, so why did the truth change? Because this is what it's saying. If we see historical changes and societies are governed by an eternal truth, then the only way they change is that they could possibly change is if that truth changed. So how does that happen? And then so the move is like, okay, so their values changed. The way people thought things ought to be changed. So then that changed the way things are. But then you get the same kind of problem with like, well then how do people's values change? Oh well, they thought a new set of things was true. And we end up in a tautology. Right? this isn't like productive. We just end up with like, what's true? What depends on what we value, and what we value depends on what we think is true. And this is when you often see like social theory do what we've seen social movement theory do here, like bounce back and forward between kind of like a sort of like positivism and kind of like, I don't know what we should call this, like relativism, basically. And this kind of just goes on and on and on and on. And you'll see like different, you can spot this in like, so I read this over the summer, and like now Julian Rose has taught me this happens, I can't like unsee it. Every time I read like a news kind of theory, I'm like, oh, okay, right, we're doing this again. We've decided that there's a set of truths. How does that set of truths change? The values change, right? Okay. And this is where like you can see this happening in the movement theory, where like this thing that like, okay, so the political structure, the law, or the truth, because truth is sort of understood as a kind of law, is fixed. That restrains us. Okay, so then the social movements theory go, okay, so that's constraining, but we haven't thought about culture. What does culture do? We come back to values. That helps us escape that kind of determinism. But then that kind of, we end up in this tautology, basically. We're like, and what is happening is that like the relationship between, basically the relationship between like, like Rose calls it like law and ethics. But we could also talk about agency and structure. Actually, that's the wrong way around. Structure and agency. Yeah, kind of like validity and value. The problem is that we're thinking of these things as binary opposites. We're thinking in dualisms, right? So it's like, so you're determined by the law. Okay, but you choose your own ethics. But you're determined by the law, but you choose your own ethics. You're determined by a structure, but you have agency. It's a contradiction. And like you'll see social theory, as it does with validity and value, bounce back and forward between these two different things. So you get like structural functionalism on this side. Then you get like symbolic interactionism on this side. But then, like we saw when we talked about collective behaviour theory, they run into the same problems because although they're on opposite sides of this dualism, they're doing the same thing. They're establishing an a priori category that determines everything else. Does this make sense? Are people lost? This is quite complicated. Don't worry too much about this. I'm doing like the kind of like deep critique, just because it's interesting, but also to sort of like give you guys a background of like why we might think stuff is wrong, how we might like, and sort of like the level of critique that we can go to, right? Like there are like really deep problems in social theory, in sociology, in philosophy, which like a lot of these people that we're talking about cannot get to the bottom of. So like when you guys are writing about them, don't feel like you have to kind of respect that they know the truth. They don't. Like they're struggling the same as you guys to try and understand all this really complicated stuff, right? And so like what Rose is showing us is like actually a lot of these theories fall into like a kind of like a really dumb trap. Like they make a move which is like silly, you know, they end up doing something quite daft, right? Where it's like you end up in a tautology where like you just end up with a circular argument. Like you just go round and round and round and round and nothing's ever explained, right? So then one of the things, so this is just sort of a way of showing you that theory is kind of like, is complicated, but also that means that it's like vulnerable. You can attack it, you can critique it. And also sort of so we can start recognising some of the bigger problems that happen in social theory. And one of these, especially if people are interested in like decolonial, post-colonial thought, this is like a real problem in like Western philosophy. Western philosophy loves to think in binary opposites. does it all the time, loves a dualism, like, and that's not necessarily true for all world philosophies. So like one of the reasons that I like a lot of African philosophies is because they don't do this, basically. Rather than thinking in terms of like a priori truths and binary opposites, it takes more of like a holistic approach where like there's an understanding of like, yeah, so like one of these that Western philosophy does is like, it counterposes like the universal and the particular. Which we can see is going on here, right? Particular interests, universal interests, like opposed to each other, contradictory. And that is like Western philosophy always does that. Like it's always like how like cannot reconcile the idea that that something might be a certain way in particular, but how does that relate to the universal? It can't understand that, so it picks one, which is what you get in like positivist accounts are like universalist accounts. This is always true, and then you can kind of get relativist accounts. Yes, like a lot of post-structural accounts like this is like, oh, actually, there's no such thing as truth. Like, it's all just different perspectives. Everyone bouncing around having different ideas, like, and it becomes just as deterministic because rather than saying there's one eternal truth, you're just saying there's no truth, which is just as limiting, basically. But then, like, if you end up with a philosophy like Ubuntu, for instance, like, it doesn't do this thing because it has a holistic approach. It sees people as both, it sees everything as both universal and particular. So like, I am an individual person, but what created me is the other people around me. Rather than the Western, I think, therefore I am, like Ubuntu says, I am because we are. And that is a way of understanding the particular within the universal. It's like, I don't have to think about how I can understand that this table is real because it's not separate from me. Whereas like Western metaphysics does that all the time. How do I know that this table is real? How do I know that it's not an illusion? Whereas like in Ubuntu it's like, that's a fucking stupid question. Like, that's not, where is it then? Like, where are you then? Like, you're separate from that? How? Like, if it's something that is an illusion, if it's something completely separate from you, how can you even tell there's anything there? Stupid, right? So like, you know, there's sort of like, so I've really gone off on one here, haven't I? I started off like, I'm just going to talk about this bit, and we ended up doing this. But it's basically what I'm showing you is that like, a lot of the bases of these theories are very problematic, and also like, are very easily challengeable, because they do silly things, basically. And one of the things that they do is not being able to understand, like, understanding this difference between the universal and the particular. And because they don't do that, they actually, and this is kind of the crucial bit, and I'll build on this critique as we go through the course, like, they're actually not very good at, actually I won't put that under Gillian Rose because that's not fair, because she's actually really good at this. I'll put it over here. Like, a lot of these theories are actually quite like bad at process because they don't understand these things as relational. They understand things as like facts and as truths. They understand society as static. Whereas like we know, like any understanding of history can tell you that there is no such thing as a static society. There is no such thing as a social system or a set of relations that lasts forever. Just not a thing. It's never happened. It never will happen. But actually a lot of these theories aren't very good at explaining that, because they end up with like, if you're having to react to a set of truths and you want to change stuff, well, how can you change anything? Because you can't, because everything is already true. You can't just introduce a new truth. And then it's like, but also of the opposite of like, if everybody is completely particular, has no relationship to each other, and all of their interests are completely separate, irreconcilable and invisible to one another, you also can have no account of change, because you can have no account of a way to relate to people in a new way, basically. because it all just becomes like, you think what you think, I think what I think. Let's call the whole thing off, basically. You know, it becomes like empty, like either blind or like empty. Well, things are process. Yeah. So there's a way that, in order to understand change, we have to understand these things as people who've been taught by me before, know what's coming already. We have to think of these things as like actually dialectical, right? These things interact with each other, and through that interaction they produce new things. So like, rather than like culture being where agency is and structure being where constraint is, you see agency in both of those things. So the way that people create, people are interacting with the world in a way where they construct meaning, but they also act upon it. So the meaning doesn't just come from an already established set of meanings, it comes from people acting on the world and that changing the way that they think about things. Does that make sense? We're going to do more of this. Sorry I'm worried I went too deep there. But I hope it was interesting. Anyway, if anyone has any questions, you can come and ask me about it. I hope I haven't confused you too much. But I think I just wanted to like close out this kind of like, yeah, because we're going to move on to some kind of different theories after this week. I wanted to kind of like do a big sum up of like what's wrong with like all of these theories we've looked at, as a way of you guys, giving you guys like the kind of assurance that you can go to town on these guys. Like, they're not right about everything. Actually, I don't think they're right about a lot of stuff. So like, if you want to pick them to bits, do it. And this is just sort of like a big picture of like, you know, you're now part of this long process of us trying to work out what the hell is going on with social movements and collective action. And these people don't have the answers. So if you want to pick holes in them, do it. If you want to ask me any questions about any of this, yeah, don't try and go and read Gillian Rose before the end of term. You're not going to do it. I mean, I'd be super impressed if you did, but you don't want that stress in your life. It's more of like a summer project if you fancy reading some like difficult philosophy. But yeah, otherwise, we'll finish a bit early because I think that's quite enough for one day. And I'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you. Oh, great. No. Further bonding? Can I take a picture first?
Oh, right, yeah. I was just trying to make it so any pictures wouldn't be confusing, because there was a bit of like words all over the place.
I must say I do get lost, so I try to being the theoretical part.
I think that was probably a bit too much.
Maybe, I don't know, that's just my perspective. Maybe we can do the theoretical part, you know, kind of on PowerPoint, so it's my easier for me to catch. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, no, I'm hello.
I emailed you about not being able to be present for the roundtable.
Oh, yeah, so I was just thinking about what we're going to do about that. I think probably the best thing to do, I forgot to say that to everybody.
I could have done it on Zoom depending on what time, because that's the thing, but like, I don't know.
Yeah, I
There's
don't...
a 5.5 hour difference, so I have to like...
Yeah, and I'm not sure like we have the facility to do like a hybrid meet like kind of thing for it. So I think perhaps the best compromise would be that like, so because like the point of the roundtable is that like you get to like interact with other people about like your ideas and stuff, which like there's not really a way that we can reproduce that without you being there.
Yeah, I know.
But I guess like probably the best thing we could do is if you that if you send me an essay plan, like I can do that a bit in an email. Do you know what I mean? Like, well,
Yeah.
I'll sort of like you can speak to me rather than everybody, which won't be quite as fun or as good. But I mean,
I was actually looking forward to it, but then I realised it's on the same day.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But yeah, sorry about that.
It's
but
okay.
That's
I'll send
all
it
that we
out.
can do, really.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, like, the only thing I could be was like, oh, like, if you did a presentation, but that's just like more work for you, and like also kind of like it's then asking you to do more than everybody else, which I don't think is really fair. Yeah, but I think that's the only solution.
Yeah,
really,
that's fine.
I'm afraid.
That's fine. Yeah.
Right,
Thank you.
no worries.
Yeah, I just got some question about this. Can I understand that this cultural framing structure treats the ideology as a combination of many frames?
Yeah.
Okay. And can I say that, or if this is about the theoretical part, I just go. I say that this culture framing theory is sort of relativism because from based on my understanding that the campaigners will try to convince people that things what should be rather than I don't know. Yeah, how do you think about?
Yeah,
Sorry, I just got lost.
It's a complicated thing to think about. Yeah, but I think you're sort of I suppose all I can say, because I mean obviously like I have a perspective on that, but the trick is for you guys to go and think about it. So I think that is definitely something to think about. Is that like because there is a way that like the framing thing, like the instrumentality, can also make it quite like relativist, like that, like that it's kind of like you convince people of a specific thing for a specific purpose, but that kind of like doesn't recognise that actually people do have ideologies, like, and that shapes the way that they do all of their framing, and like, and and part of that comes from like a lot of like these theories have an underpinning of like a liberal ideology, which in the way our politics works is liberalism gets to say that it isn't an ideology. But it does underpin all the framing. So it's kind of like, I mean, we get to that more towards the end of the course, but there is like a sort of a sense that like, I think there's also a kind of thing of like, a lot of these theorists, because they're coming from that kind of like liberalish centre position, see all ideology as bad, because liberalism sees itself as a non-ideology. And like communism, socialism, fascism, anarchism, whatever, as being ideologies, and ideologies are bad. But liberalism is itself an ideology. So like it kind of, there's a kind of like we can see, as we can see like kind of some of this stuff coming out of it, we can also see a kind of like an implicit like set of norms or commitments underneath it, which we don't normally share, and that's like, and which we don't all share. And that's one of the things that like a lot of theorists from the global south, which I'll talk about in future lectures as well, critique a lot of these theories for, is it's very set up to understand like protest in liberal societies, and like in response to liberal states, whereas like what do you do if you're not in one? And it operates very differently.
Sure. Okay, one last question. Is this theory believe that the frame came from the interaction of the people, like the function?
It kind of like it came from like people critiquing like the resource mobilization and political process theory for being functionalist, and they're like, oh, you're thinking about the social structure too much, you need to think about culture, and then the framing process is kind of like an incorporation of an understanding of culture into that sort of resource mobilization political process model way, which is what I was talking about when it's like it incorporates basically it does on this level what it had already done on that level. It kind of like, so it responds to the critique, which is good. It's like, okay, you said we don't understand that, you're right, we don't, we need to understand it. Then the way it does it is still has all the theoretical baggage with which it did the other bit, which you can still critique it on those grounds, basically.
I think that's all. Thank you very
much.
Could you remind me when your office hours are?
The Tuesdays at 2, so like before the lecture, basically.
Have you got any other time free? Because I've got lectures all day Tuesday.
I also do, like, Fridays is quite a good day for me. I often have dissertation supervisions on a Friday, but I could do an office hour as well.
Okay. So I'm a bit, because with the examination we're going to have to apply 2 or more theories to a protest of our choice.
Yes.
And I think I am a bit confused about the differences between some of the theories.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if I could possibly, when you're free, run through it and see if I've got it. And
Yeah,
because I
for sure.
don't
Yeah,
think I have.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is difficult, especially when
yeah.
it's like a lot of them, like especially the ones we've done over the past 3 weeks,
Mm.
are all interrelated.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things that will help is once we do like next week and the week after, it's kind of like, because this was all like the American theory,
Okay.
basically, and then we're going to do like the European theory,
Okay.
like, and they are more obviously different.
Okay.
Whereas like, and I guess, so it's kind of like, in social movement theory, like the kind of, there's sort of often understood in like the classical movement theory, which is kind of what we're doing on the course, is like, there's like kind of 4 big ones, and it's like collective behaviour theory, so that's week 1. Resource mobilisation theory, which is like, week 2, and then resource mobilisation theory, which is week 3. Then the political process theory, which is like this week and last week. And then it's the new social movement theories, which we're going to do over the next couple of weeks. So yeah, I think it will become more apparent,
Okay.
and I will try and be less confusing as I was today.
Well,
Was this a
'cause
bit?
it's-
Was this a bit much? I got the
No,
sense
so
it was a bit much.
I like this.
Okay, good.
I find it interesting. I'm an accounting student.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
So I just every year I've taken a sociology student just to balance out my brain
Yeah.
because I find it more interesting than accounting, surprisingly. Shouldn't have really done accounting, but never mind.
That's all right. Yeah.
But so yeah, I really like this, but it's more about I'm in my brain as potentially maybe other students are. It's like, okay, how am I gonna do the exam? How can this be in the exam?
Well, I mean, it is an essay, not an exam.
Yeah.
But yeah, but like yeah. I mean, I guess this is kind of like Again, I think I didn't mean to go into this much of it. I just sort of
It's interesting.
kept going, and like halfway through, I was like, oh my god, shut up! But it was too late.
But you can tell that you're like this. You're really interested in this, and that's why like there's so many people in your lectures.
Oh, thank you.
Because like
But yeah, but I think I guess maybe that's one of the things I'll try and clarify next week. Is that when I'm doing the critique bit at the end, like I try and start with like the obvious critique,
Yeah.
like with framing, it's like it's an instrumental way to understand something that people don't actually. That's not people's like effective relationship to it. It's like the meanings that movements produce
Yes.
aren't just like it's not a marketing campaign.
No.
They're telling you what they believe. It's not
Yeah.
which is a different thing.
But could
So-
you not say with framing that could be linked to say like how people have grown up? Framing is potentially put forward by your parents' beliefs and
Yeah.
taught through that way.
Yeah, and I guess this is kind of like where we're sort of, and that's when I was getting into kind of like the more complicated stuff of like cultural determinism. Because
I
that kind
don't
of
know what that means.
that kind of is maybe that's something I need to do a bit more about. But like that's a kind of like idea that like so it's that like all of this mess determines us.
Yes.
So that would be like culture is something that happens to you. So like you're taught a certain way of understanding the world by your parents, by
it's
society.
relative to who's around you.
Yeah.
And kind of what you pick up, I guess.
And then what this is kind of what framing tries to do and is criticised for is having a more like agentic approach to that, which is like all of those resources around you, those cultural ideas and stuff, like you can use. So it doesn't just it's not determining. It's actually like a resource you can use.
Yeah.
And then they have this whole argument, which is sort of like this thing,
Okay.
where like they're like, okay, so culture determines you. No, it doesn't. You can just pick it up and use it however you like.
Yeah.
And then it's like, and what I'm sort of moving towards, which is like my Marxist understanding, which you can take or leave, which is that like you have to understand these things as like neither of those things is true. Like the truth is in the middle. It's like that you are neither entirely determined or entirely free, and that like you exist in a certain set of you exist in a certain culture, you exist in a certain political structure, but you have the agency to do with that what you will. And often, and one of the things I'll get to as well, which actually often is like, you can also have a critique of like the individualism of these ideas, which is like it's all understanding like he was one of these dots, when like actually what we are is much more than that, and like often what freedom is actually something that we do together, not something that you have by yourself. Which is one which I think is a much more kind of like interesting and like potentially emancipatory vision of what movements are. It's like people trying to become something else together, rather than it being like I am an individual unit that stays the same, and I'm trying to get other people to do what I want. But it's like, because it's also like the kind of like the dialectical understanding is that when you do things, you don't just change the world around you, you change. So it's like in all processes, all of these different interactions between things, the world changes, but so do you. And like that's kind of like, to me that's like the beauty of Marx, is that's what he's describing, is that like his like we're not beings, we are becomings sort of thing. Like that's what the world is like it's a process of interacting things becoming something else.
I suppose it's like water filling a container. Like it can change container.
Yeah, I mean the metaphor I usually use is that like like Western philosophy thinks of society as like a boulder, and you're trying to push it but you can't. Like you're trying to move something that's still. But like what Marx is saying is no, society is a river. Like so it's something that flows and it changes direction. And like it's never and then it's the classic like